Well, hello. My name is Angel Wood, and this is Crime of the Truest Kind. This is Crime of the Truest Kind, Massachusetts and New England crime stories, history, and advocacy. I spent a fair amount of my day today at the vet with one of my guys who's having some troubles. Think good things. In 1 week, Friday, June 20th, the gathering of remembrance and hope for Debra Melo, the 25th anniversary of her disappearance. We will meet at Memorial Park in Taunton, Massachusetts, her hometown, from 6 to 8 p.m. Now, everyone's invited, whether you knew her or not. I was able to work with her family members to put this together. It is also the 25th anniversary of the disappearance of Molly Bish from Warren, Massachusetts. Debra and Molly disappeared 7 days from one another. No, I don't believe their cases are tied. Not at all. It's just a great deal of sadness to happen in a short period of time. The Bish family are also holding an anniversary vigil on the 28th of June. While Molly Bish was found 3 years after she disappeared, her case remains unsolved. Thank you to patrons and supporters of the show. I will be at True Crime Podcast Festival. It's happening the weekend of July 18th. It's in Massachusetts this year. It's in Danvers. They advertise it as Boston, but those of us who are local know. Whatever the case, I will be there, and you can be too. Passes and single-day tickets are available. TrueCrimePodcastFestival.com is where you get them, and if you use my name, Angel, Angelle, you get 20% off the purchase of your pass or your ticket. Last week's show, I talked about Jolly Jane Taunton, a 19th century New England serial killer. As I researched, I became more and more curious about the other serial killers from our history. This week, in episode 88, the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, Boston, Massachusetts. Before the term serial killer entered the mainstream sometime in the 70s, these kinds of crimes were referred to in various terms: mass murderers, stranger-on-stranger killings, recreational killing, pattern murders, thrill killing, psycho murder, lust murderers, butchers, sex slayers, vampires. None of them quite hit, you know? The precursor to what is now used to universally describe an individual who commits multiple murders over a period of time in separate events was the sequence killer. That may sound very familiar, those of you who are fans of the show Mindhunter. But it did not fully paint the picture of what the investigators were learning. Serial killer was first used in 1974, marking a shift toward recognizing the pattern of repeated murders. And FBI agent Robert Ressler, who is one of the agents depicted in the show, he coined the phrase. The golden age of serial killing is a time when the number of active serial killers in the U.S. was at its height. According to the University of Michigan data that tracked the number of serial killers and the years of activity, 1986 was the peak year in the United States. With murders by serial killers in the U.S. at its highest between 1970 and 1990. The golden age of some of the most sadistic murderers of our time, and starring some of the most sensationalized killers in our grim history. Now, if you're listening to this, you probably know the names: Bundy, Ramirez, Kemper, Gacy, Rader, D'Angelo, Ridgway, Warnos, The numbers have steadily declined, due in large part to societal shifts. But we have seen modern-day cases like that of the Gilgo Beach serial killer in Long Island. A Massapequa Park architect named Rex Heuermann is charged with 7 murders. The 61-year-old father of 2 has pleaded not guilty to crimes spanning from 1993 to 2011. It's a case that will likely go to trial or trials beginning next year. Now, of course, Heuermann's defense is trying to separate the cases into multiple trials, saying so many allegations presented to a jury together may have an adverse effect. Laying out all of that evidence is not going to be easy for any juror. These 7 murders that Heuermann is currently charged with, the original Gilgo 4, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Amberlynn Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and 3 additional women, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Sandra Castilla. Megan Waterman from Maine, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes was from Connecticut. And there's Shannon Gilbert, who disappeared and was eventually recovered. She's the reason why the Gilgo 4 were even discovered in the first place. Her death has been ruled undetermined. Everyone questions whether Heuermann is responsible for her death. We don't know. Shannon's death doesn't match the pattern of the others. A serial killer is defined by a person who commits a series of murders, often with no apparent motive, and following a predictable behavior pattern. They exhibit a variety of psychological traits, often including psychopathy, childhood trauma, and difficulty with empathy and emotional regulation. While not all serial killers fit a single profile, some common psychological features include a history of abuse, impulsivity, manipulation. They disregard the rules and social norms and have a tendency towards a fascination with violence. We see these traits of psychopathy in the superficial charm, the grandiosity, the lack of remorse, and the impulsivity in these people. They find great enjoyment in seeking out and targeting vulnerable people. They are skilled manipulators. They master that charm and deception to gain control over others for their own monstrous purposes. We cannot predict whether someone will grow up to be a psychopath. But when someone is discovered to be a psychopathic killer, you can often trace it back to their childhood. Of those convicted serial killers that I listed just now, there is a history of trauma in their childhoods. A significant number have experienced childhood trauma, be it physical, sexual, emotional, or extreme neglect, which materializes in difficulties with emotional regulation and attachment. They struggle to understand or feel for others. Some predators have an ability to suppress emotional responses to their trauma, and that opens up an ability to inflict harm without guilt or remorse. They fail to consider the consequences of those actions. There is almost always an unhealthy interest in violent acts, thoughts about harming others, a result of their early childhood experiences. They often don't entirely recognize or straight up disregard societal rules, the protocols. They have no respect for authority and are okay breaking laws. We've learned this over time. Since the earliest days of scientific study about the behaviors of what we now call the serial killer, we have learned the result of early separation from their mothers in childhood. It affects almost everything about their emotional health. There is no single archetype. Like all of us, an individual's process differs. Their backgrounds, their motivations, there are always multiple factors at play. And if we have learned anything about this at all, we know that behavior is so much more than just nature versus nurture. It's a combination of psychological, biological, and environmental factors at play. The difference between female serial killers and male serial killers is purpose. For men, it's often sexual gratification, power, and control. The female serial killer typically kills for a utilitarian, a practical purpose. They want to gain something, usually money, I recently had a crime show on in the background as I was doing some research. It was a very scary people with Donnie Wahlberg, if you must know. He's a Boston kid, come on. I learned about the case of Judy Bonanno. She was a woman originally from Texas, and she moved around quite a bit. Her childhood was marked by tragedy. Her mother died when she was 4. That definitely put up emotional roadblocks for her, detrimental to healthy emotional attachments. She and her brother were sent to live with her grandparents. Later, when her father remarried, he brought them to live with his new family in Roswell, New Mexico. When Judy was 14, she showed her first sign of trouble when she attacked her father, his new wife, and her 2 boys. Because there were no juvenile courts or places juveniles could go, she was sent to an adult prison in New Mexico to serve time with career criminals and lifers. From there, she went to reform school. It's not clear when she became a serial poisoner, but she was motivated by money. She killed husbands, boyfriends, even her own son for insurance payouts. She liked poison and thought nothing of slipping some to her disabled son. Then, it gets better, worse. She took that son, Michael, and her other son out on a canoe one afternoon. She propped Michael up in his lawn chair, then she capsized the boat. Michael wore heavy leg braces, and he sunk to the bottom of the lake, pulled down by the weight of the heavy braces that covered his legs. Not unlike Jane Taunton, who I told you about. She was an American serial killer, a poisoner, who experienced the loss of her own mother very young. The lack of this relationship affected her profoundly. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but it's a major factor. We will never know its true extent. She was caught and convicted of the 1971 murder of her first husband, James Goodyear, the 1980 murder of her son, Michael, and the 1983 attempted murder of her boyfriend, John Gentry, for whom her son, James Goodyear, was charged as an accomplice, accused of wiring Gentry's car with a bomb that nearly killed him. Her son was acquitted in a separate trial. Most of the people she killed were unaware that she had taken out an insurance policy on them. Further investigations into deaths involving her resulted in the death penalty. After numerous appeals, she was executed in Florida's electric chair on March 30th, 1998. She was just 54 years old. Florida, man, Florida will kill you. She is only one of 2 female serial killers executed in Florida and the first woman executed in Florida since 1848. No other women have been executed by electric chair in Florida since her case. You probably know the name Aileen Wuornos, a more familiar name in the Florida lady serial killer sphere. She was charged in the deaths of 7 men, convicted and executed by lethal injection in 2002. Talk about a sad case. She was born into neglect and sexual abuse. Her father was convicted of sexual abuse on a child after she was born, and he died by suicide in prison a few years later. Aileen's mother abandoned her and her brother when they were small. They were taken in by their grandparents, a grandfather who was abusive physically. By the time she was 11, she had learned the currency of her own sexuality and traded favors for money, beer, and cigarettes. I told you about 2 Florida women killers to illustrate the connection between mothers and children. And if a child does not get to form some kind of bond, it can almost dictate the future of that child, or at least these children. It is not to say everyone that had a bad childhood is going to grow up to be a sadistic killer, but if they do grow up to be a sadistic and heartless serial killer, you can pretty much predict how they got there. Like the case of the Boston Strangler. In the early 60s, there was a rash of murders across the city. Between June 1962 and January 1964, 13 women were found. All but 2 of them had been strangled. On June 14, 1962, we are just about 63 years ago to the day, the first victim of the Boston Strangler was murdered. The killer at large was thought to be a lone sociopath, a phantom fiend, a sex degenerate. The murders were particularly disturbing. Some of the victims were considered to be elderly women. The brutality of the crimes, coupled with the vulnerability of the women involved, compounded this tragedy. The victims, who ranged in age from 19 to 85, were sexually assaulted brutally and found dead in their homes. Most lived alone. Most of the women had been strangled. Police began to connect the cases through the modus operandi, the MO. Victims were strangled by their own clothing, with the killer tying a bow around the victim's neck. Sometimes they left a calling card to taunt the police. The first victim included in the Boston Strangler lore was a 55-year-old woman who was sexually assaulted and strangled in her ransacked apartment. In the following months, several other women, ranging from 65 to 85, were found in similar states. The news panicked the city, naturally. Nearly all of the manpower on the Boston police force was transferred to the search for this so-called mother killer. Over the course of several months, women were being found across Boston, only some of which appeared to be victims of this bow-tying monster. In December, a young woman was killed, and 3 weeks later, another young woman was found strangled. The victims were a range of ages, but the markings of the killer created a pattern. By January 1964, 13 were dead. A man named Albert DeSalvo became the #1 suspect in the investigation. At the time, DeSalvo was being held for observation on unrelated charges at Bridgewater State Hospital. DeSalvo reportedly confessed to a cellmate. Albert DeSalvo began a life of sex crimes in the late 1950s. As the measuring man, he cased young women, knocking on their doors under the guise of being a model scout. If he gained entrance into their home, he would motion to take measurements and then assault the women. He got caught and ended up doing a little time for it. But then he was back out again. During that stint, he came up with his next persona, Green Man, wearing a green handyman jumpsuit. I imagine it as a jumpsuit anyway. He began a reign of terror through a series of home invasions, attacking women across New England, Massachusetts. He went to Connecticut, Rhode Island, and to New Hampshire. This became known as the Green Man crimes, where he'd tie them up, sexually assault them, dressed as a handyman in the green coveralls. By 1962, he ratcheted up his violence. In June, he attacked Ann Slezers, strangling her with her housecoat and fashioning a crude bow around her neck. This would become his signature. There seems to be no known connection to the women, except that they were alone. Some would be found within days of each other. Others were found on the same day. The death toll associated with the Strangler murders is 13, or 11, and varying theories exist. The murder of 85-year-old Mary Mullen, who was found in her Boston home on June 28, 1962, is unlike the other victims who would be found. She did not die from strangulation, the common method of this perpetrator. Mary Mullen's death was ruled as a result of a heart attack, reportedly brought on when an intruder entered her home. While she is named among these Strangler victims, it's unlikely that she was actually a victim of the Strangler. Mary Mullen's death remains part of the debate about the actual number of Strangler victims. Mary Brown, another woman associated with the Strangler case, may not fit the same pattern of the other Strangler victims. Many of the women lived alone. They would be sexually assaulted before being strangled with something that belonged to them: stockings, a belt, a scarf, a bra. This case has always kicked up controversy because it's unclear as to whether one person or several are responsible. The victims varied in age and background and circumstances, leading many to believe the multiple killer theory. Anna Elza Slezers, 55, was a Latvian immigrant. She was found June 14, 1962, at 77 Gainsborough Street in Boston. Mary Mullen, 85, found June 28, 1962, at 1435 Commonwealth Ave in Boston. She suffered a heart attack. Helen Elizabeth Blake, 65, found June 30th, 1962, at 73 Newhall Street in Lynn, Massachusetts. Here's where I mention not all of the victims were in Boston proper. Nina Naoma Nichols, 68, found June 30th, 1962, in Brighton at 1940 Commonwealth Ave, which is part of Boston. Edez Ida Erga, 75, found August 19, 1962, at 7 Grove Street in Boston's West End. Jane Sullivan, 67, found August 20, 1962, at 435 Columbia Road in Dorchester. Sophie Clark, 20, found December 5, 1962, at 315 Huntington Ave in Boston. There are suggestions that Sophie was killed by somebody else. She was a young black college student, and she had roommates. It didn't fit the MO. Patricia Jane Bissett was 23 and pregnant when she was found on December 31st, 1962, at 515 Park Drive in Boston, which is now BU Housing, Boston University Housing. Marianne Brown, 69, found March 6, 1963, at 319 Park Street in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She was beaten, stabbed, raped, and strangled. A questionable MO. Beverly Florence Salmons, 23, found May 6, 1963, in Cambridge. She had been working part-time at the Medfield State Hospital. She was stabbed, and she was found with stockings and a scarf knotted around her neck. She lived at 4 University Road in Cambridge off Mount Auburn. Unlike the other victims, she was stabbed 21 times in addition to strangulation, leading to doubts about whether she was killed by the same person. Maria Evelina Evelyn Corbin, 58, found September 8, 1963, at 224 Lafayette Street in Salem, Massachusetts. Joanne Marie Graff, 23, found November 23, 1963. She had recently moved from Chicago and worked as a secretary. She was found at 54 Essex Street in Lawrence, Massachusetts. There are indications in her case that she was killed by someone else. Victim 13, Marianne Sullivan, 19 years old, found January 4th, 1964. She had recently made the move from the Cape to Boston. She was found in the apartment she shared with 2 other women at 44A Charles Street in Boston. That is Beacon Hill. 2 women who wrote for the Boston Record American in 1962 made the connections. Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole began to notice a pattern developing. Their work was disregarded at the time due to sexism in the newsroom and victims being nobodies and disinterest from authorities. Their reporting on the murders laid the groundwork of what was to come. As the death toll rose, and that a killer was showing up at women's homes and being let in, women began to carry pepper spray, hat pins, and tear gas guns. Tear gas gun. I don't know what that is, but I want to find out. And that would be something you would not want to trigger when you jam your hand in your bag, rooting around for something. There was a Hulu series about the women and the Strangler case. It features Keira Knightley and Carrie Coon. Women who lived alone were told to lock all of their doors and windows and let no one in without positive identification. Shit, you know I say that now. Albert DeSalvo was disturbed. We could predict his earlier years. Raised by a brutally abusive father in the 40s and 50s, he would bring prostitutes home. It was a different time, the language has changed, and have sex with them in front of his family before viciously beating his wife and his children. DeSalvo's father punched his mother so hard he knocked out her teeth. He broke her fingers one by one as she laid unconscious on the floor. Cruelty was the point. Then he sold his kids to go and be farmhands. Albert DeSalvo showed signs early in his life: torturing animals, petty theft, shoplifting. In November of 1943, when he was 12, he was arrested for robbery and battery. That got him sent to a reformatory for the first of 2 terms, where students were subjected to strict discipline and corporal punishment. Lyman School for Boys was in Westboro, and not just home to one serial killer. Stanley Rice was sent to Lyman. He grew up in Concord and exhibited the same antisocial behaviors. He would start fires in his basement at home. He went on to commit heinous crimes against children. In interviews, Rice spoke of being molested by a man in a barn near a railroad crossing in his hometown of Concord, Massachusetts. He was sent to Lyman in the summer of 1955, where he said that he was forced to engage in sexual acts with other boys. He developed a sexual fascination with blood and seeing young boys defecate. He traveled around the country before returning to his family's new home in Auburndale, Massachusetts, part of Newton, where he was arrested for having weapons without a license. That got him sent to the Metropolitan State Hospital that was technically in Waltham. He spent 6 months in the Billerica House of Corrections and was released. He left Massachusetts but would return, being hospitalized again before escaping and running to where? You guessed it, Florida. Stanley Rice was a serial murderer and pedophile who chronicled his abuses that he suffered as a child and the abuses he subjected other children to. He confessed to the murder of a Florida boy. That boy's friend gave a description that matched Rice when he was pulled over by police. Authorities only connected him to a murder in Ohio, one in Ontario, and the Mother's Day killing in Florida. Other victims have gone unconfirmed. Stanley Rice's confession led police in Concord, Massachusetts, where he grew up, to a secret cache of weapons, photographs of naked boys dating back to 1961. In his diary, where he chronicled his crimes, he spoke of the methods he used in scouting for young boys in area swimming pools, lakes, ponds, and fishing holes. He would seek out young boys, engage them in conversation, pose false scenarios, and isolate them, then force them at gunpoint to pose for photographs and assault them. Along with his weapon of intimidation, he always carried a camera to document. Stanley Everett Rice murdered as many as 5 young boys between 1963 and 1968. It is unknown whether Stanley Rice is responsible for any murders in New England, but I'll bet you $10 he's responsible for abusing boys here. Stanley Rice died in a Florida prison in 2007. Albert DeSalvo did 2 stints in lineman, then enlisted in the Army. He was given an honorable discharge. Then he re-enlisted, despite being involved in a court-martial case where he was accused of touching a 9-year-old girl. And during the period when these murders were taking place, Albert DeSalvo reportedly lived on Florence Street in Malden. Don't worry though, I'm pretty sure it's now a Citizens Bank. On October 27, 1964, Albert DeSalvo attacked and raped another woman, but stopped short of killing her. That woman called the police and gave a description of her attacker, and police went looking for DeSalvo. When he was arrested for the Boston murders in 1964, he was just 33 years old. DeSalvo confessed to the murders to his cellmate, George Nasser. Nasser told his attorney about DeSalvo. That attorney took DeSalvo on as a client. That attorney, F. Lee Bailey, who was on the infamous Dream Team. In a plea deal, DeSalvo was not charged with the Boston Strangler murders. His prison sentence would be for the Green Man rapes. During interviews, DeSalvo gave details about the cases that were never made public, and some of the very grisly details to the things done to the women. While DeSalvo confessed to the Strangler murders, whether for notoriety or something else, like immunity from prosecution in those crimes, his guilt was in dispute for decades. It has been a long-held belief by investigators and case experts that not all the 13 victims were killed by the same person. Even some of the surviving assault victims did not believe Albert DeSalvo was their attacker. The last victim, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, was found raped and strangled in the bedroom of her apartment at 44A Charles Street in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. The crime scene showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting she may have known her attacker or let him in willingly. Mary Sullivan was new in Boston, in that apartment, in that neighborhood, new to the roommates. Maybe it was a Phoenix listing ad. She didn't know anyone. She had just moved there days before. Her murder was particularly brutal, shocking to the residents of this affluent neighborhood that is just minutes to the Boston Common and the State House. Beacon Hill has a quintessential New England aesthetic, that historic charm of Federal-style architecture that emerged after the American Revolution. It is one of the only places where historic cobblestone streets still exist in the city. And you will trip walking up some of those hilly streets, I'll tell you. It was elite then, and it still is now. The area was home to wealthy residents, politicians and professionals. People like Sylvia Plath and Robert Frost once lived there. Mary Sullivan was from Cape Cod and embarking on the next phase of her life. She had been there only a matter of days when she was found. I'm sure there are many theories, like whoever was responsible was there for one of her roommates in the apartment, not her. Her nephew, Casey Sherman, dug deep into his Aunt Mary's story. As an investigative journalist, he spent time as a television news reporter and producer at WBZ4 in Boston, where he first began an in-depth look into her murder. As an author, his first book is about his Aunt Mary's case, who died before he was even born. A Rose for Mary, The Hunt for the Real Boston Strangler, was released in 2003, after Sherman viewed the case and questioned Albert DeSalvo's involvement, arguing that his confession was riddled with contradictions. He explored other suspects, like the boyfriend of one of her roommates. In 2000, Mary Sullivan's remains were exhumed in an attempt to get new evidence in her case. In December 2001, DeSalvo was exhumed. Forensic experts conducted DNA testing on evidence from Mary Sullivan's murder. Those results showed that DeSalvo's DNA did not match biological evidence found on Mary Sullivan's body. In 2009 and in 2012, the city of Boston would use funding it received under the National Institute of Justice, the NIJ, their cold case program to test DNA from a nephew of DeSalvo's. They ran it, and there was a hit. 10 years after that book was published, DNA was tested from Mary Sullivan against seminal fluid found on Mary and a blanket at the crime scene. It was tested against DNA that was obtained when investigators retrieved a discarded water bottle from one of DeSalvo's nephews and compared it to DNA evidence. The results showed a familial match, leading to 99.9% certainty that DeSalvo was her killer. This part of the story is a good what the fuck moment. The Boston police sergeant and surveillance expert who followed the nephew, Tim DeSalvo, to his work site and retrieved a discarded water bottle that would break the case in the murder of Mary Sullivan is Boston Police Sergeant Brian Albert, of the Alberts who formerly resided at 34 Fairview Road in Canton, Massachusetts. Yep, those Alberts. Mary Sullivan's case is the only case in the Boston Strangler investigation with a forensic conclusion. Albert DeSalvo did rape and murder Mary Sullivan in 1964. With that, authorities concluded that DeSalvo is most likely responsible for the rapes and murders of the other women. This is based on his confessions, where he provided details of the crime scenes, including information that was never made public. Patterns found at the crime scene where victims were strangled, often with their own clothing, and many were sexually assaulted. The method of killing was consistent across a majority of the cases. There were no signs anyone forced themselves into the homes of these women. They let them in willingly. This also suggests that the killer had a pleasant demeanor and was possibly charming to these women, and their defenses were down. DeSalvo was said to have that sort of personality. Remember the one I explained at the top of the show? After Mary Sullivan was killed, months passed. Then, on October 27, 1964, a Cambridge woman called police to report an intruder had broken in, tied her up, and assaulted her. He then untied her, mumbled an "I'm sorry," and ran out. The description she gave of her attacker sounded exactly like someone detectives already knew: 32-year-old Albert DeSalvo, known as Measuring Man. It only came to light after his arrest that DeSalvo was the Green Man rapist. A psychiatrist diagnosed DeSalvo as potentially suicidal and quite clearly overtly schizophrenic, and he was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital on February 4, 1965, until further order of the court. While hospitalized in Bridgewater, DeSalvo first began insinuating that he was the Boston Strangler. DeSalvo, who F. Lee Bailey agreed to represent, was promised immunity from prosecution in the Strangler murders, and went under hypnosis and made confessions on tape where he gave grisly details of the murder scenes. Information only the murderer would know. In every case attributed to the Strangler, the women were raped, sometimes with foreign objects, and laid out naked on display. Their deaths were from strangulation. Ligatures were the woman's stockings, a pillowcase, a belt off the robe that she had been wearing. All were tied and exaggerated with a bow left around the victim's neck. Unbelievably, in 1967, DeSalvo escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital with 2 other inmates. This triggered the biggest manhunt in New England history. Howling bloodhounds canvassed the woods around the state hospital, and police, by foot, by car, by air, searched for the escaped sex degenerate Albert DeSalvo and the 2 other inmates, Frederick E. Erickson, a 40-year-old murderer, and armed robber George W. Harrison, no relation, 35. The men used a key that they made to unlock the cell doors. Erickson and Harrison surrendered after drunkenly calling authorities from a bar somewhere in the Boston area. With DeSalvo on the run, the city braced for another crime. But another crime didn't come. On the lam for just a day, DeSalvo would be arrested. He was 40 miles away from the hospital in Lynn. DeSalvo's 2 brothers were arrested and charged with being accessories after the fact. DeSalvo had transferred $2,600 in veterans and Social Security payments to them. After his capture, he was sent to Walpole Maximum Security Prison, where he stayed. He wanted people to believe he was mentally unfit, as did his attorney. Albert DeSalvo was convicted of assaults related to the Measuring Man and the Green Man attacks. As the Green Man, he broke into hundreds of houses across New England, assaulting women. The trial took place in Cambridge from January 11th to 18th, 1967. He would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. After serving just 6 years of that life sentence, DeSalvo was stabbed by another inmate and died. He was 42. There's all kinds of speculation as to why he was killed. It all goes along with if he was or was not the Strangler. Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders, and then he recanted, leaving more lingering doubts about who was responsible for these violent murders. Lynn Museum and Arts Center Facebook page shares the details of his capture. On this day in history, February 25th, 1967, Lynn made national news when Albert DeSalvo, known as the Boston Strangler, was apprehended at Simon's Shoe Store at Western Ave and Federal Street, having made a daring escape from Bridgewater State Hospital the previous day. Here he is seen, there's a photograph. Here he is seen being escorted out of the Lynn Police Station to be taken to Walpole State Prison by Lynn Police Lieutenant Francis Broadbine, Patrolman Eugene Begley, Patrolman John Bryson, Patrolman Adam Kakowski, Captain Joseph F. Coppinger, and Lieutenant William Cronin of the Massachusetts State Police, among others. Oh, he in fact is wearing a sailor's uniform. Like so many of these stories that I share with you, this is another one where decades have passed and the stories get told and retold. One thing we know is that we're never going to really know. With the exception of the case of Mary Sullivan, who is considered the last victim of the Boston Strangler. DNA evidence made it possible for them to come to that conclusion. It is a fascinating case, and there have been books and movies and docuseries and articles written, but all of these women were murdered and murdered brutally, and they're unsolved. Thank you for listening. My name is Angelle Wood. This is Crime of the Truest Kind, Massachusetts and New England crime stories, history, and advocacy. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the show. Thank you to my patrons on Patreon who help keep this thing afloat. Welcome, Sandy. Thank you to my superstar EP, Lisa McColgan. I have been working behind the scenes on things. The technical issues, I feel like I finally ironed out. Thank you very much. I'm a bit preoccupied right now with my doggie, so bear with me. Follow the show at Crime of the Truest Kind. Everything online, crimeofthetruestkind.com. Tell your friends about the show. Share it. Leave a 5-star rating and review. Drop a tip in the jar. You will be giving the dogs a bone. They really need it. They could use the extra love. I am in Taunton next Friday for the Debra Melo gathering for the 25th anniversary of her disappearance. Saturday, the day after Debra's gathering, I leave for a week. And then when we come back, it's 4th of July weekend. I'm not taking a big break. Historically, I have taken like a summer hiatus, but I don't plan on taking a bunch of time off. So, I said all that to say, new episodes resume in July. I gotta go now. Absolutely lock your goddamn doors.